Well, folks, welcome to the Noble Man Podcast. I'm excited to have as our guest Jason Snook. Jason is a member at Third Church in Richmond, and he is a three-time graduate of Virginia Tech. I've got a couple of Hokies in my house, so big fans of all the work that goes on there in Blacksburg. But got connected with Jason because of his interest in intergenerational ministry. So we're going to have a fun conversation about a number of things here involving men. So Jason, welcome to the Noble Man Podcast.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, well, I appreciate. Hey, I know that you are at Third Church and you were just voted on to be an elder on the session there. And so tell me about the process of what did it look like for you to get installed in that position and called to that place? I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, so we've been part of Third since I think 2017.
Okay.
Been a choppy couple years here for everybody, I think. But
Sure.
just getting to know the church, I was drawn to. We as a family were drawn there just because of their kind of not just the missional focus, but a regional focus. And so certain churches are absolutely called to the neighborhoods that they're in. Third has this vision for the Richmond as a region, and what we could do to foster transformative change and restoration. So that really drew us there, and spent a couple of years and still help with local missions work in Richmond, as we'll probably get to.
Sure.
But yeah, last fall, it's probably about a year ago, they approached me about coming on session. You come on for 3 years at a time, and then there was discernment. There was a discipleship component to it, training. So we're trying to equip our leaders. And then I came on in January for first of 3 years term.
And that's a pretty heavy responsibility. I serve in a leadership team on our church. We don't call them elders in my church, but we call it the pastoral leadership team. But same sort of function, and it is to give prayerful discernment, leadership, guidance, participate with the pastors in the leadership of the local church. So thank you for your faithfulness in serving the kingdom in that way. That's really cool. Yeah.
So.
Well, listen, what caught my attention about you was a conversation that I had with a mutual friend about intergenerational discipleship, the value of, I try not to use the term old men, although sometimes it leaks out. I use the term seasoned men more often than not, because guys who've been through multiple seasons, I say they are seasoned men, and they have wisdom and experience and often time and energy that they can share with younger men. And I know part of your story is that you got intercepted a couple of times by some men who invested strategically and intentionally in your life. So tell me a little bit about your faith walk and how people have invested in you.
Yeah. And I hope we could kind of bring honor back to that term old man.
Yeah.
When I say it, it's a sign of respect, and and even the Bible's posture towards gray hair being a crown of glory.
Right.
I won't have much gray hair ever, but if I had hair, it might be gray. So that's a quite accomplished. It's an accomplishment. I think it's an honor, and I absolutely do honor the older men and women around me, because I think that's what we're supposed to do. But yeah, I mean, I thought about it as I was kind of thinking through our conversation, and I've just been lucky enough to have people. I wish I could say I was smart enough to seek out mentorship. I do now, but early on, I was like a lot of people that I think, just kind of happens, So I'll get to kind of my faith story in a second, but as early as my first job, I had a boss, and she was just invested in my growth. I came to her cubicle once for a meeting, and she's like, "Where's your notebook?" I said, "What do you mean?" She's like, "If I tell you something, how are you going to write it down?" I said, and she sent me back to my desk.
Right.
To get a notebook. So to this day, I don't show up for a meeting without a notebook. I knew her heart, and it was to grow me. And so I didn't take it in a bad way. So I've always just received that well. So I think that's probably the first part, is just a posture of discipleship. And then fast forward to when I get to college, I didn't come to Christ till I was 20. So
Right.
I was a junior at Tech, and just a really cool place. I ended up getting to really stay there for 9 years, get my bachelor's, master's, and PhD there in computer science. And it became kind of a Damascus for me, like a place where I could kind of, right in the middle of that 9 year stint, come to Christ. And really, it was painfully obvious. I had no idea what being a Christian was what it involved. And so for a long time, I would just go. There's a chapel in the middle of Tech's campus, and I would just go there each day and just pray for a while. Like, God, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And then slowly but surely, in His timing, He started to put into my life peers that could love on me, and then older men that could really, come alongside me. And we had a really strong discipleship culture there. There was an intentionality about it. The pastors that would really, seek out young leaders and develop a cadence. I used to lift weights with one of them
Yeah.
just to get time.
Yeah, so I think the chapel that you're talking about is the War Memorial Chapel at Tech, right? It's right
Yep.
under the War
Right in
Memorial.
there.
Yeah, so familiar with that. Now, remind me the name of the church, because we talked about that before. It's a church that's really focused on reaching students there on campus in Blacksburg. So tell me a little bit about that church, because it really has a youthful feel to it, I think. Lots of student engagement there.
Absolutely. At the time, it was New Life Campus Fellowship. Now it's New Life Christian Fellowship, NLCF. And just thousands of students have gone through there over the
Yeah,
years. And again, to your point, very intentional discipleship. Like if you wanted to lead a small group, we called them home groups at the time. We used the words, you had to apprentice the leader.
right.
Like, and so there was very much this idea of you are apprenticing, you're learning from this other leader. There was really no shortcut around that. You were going to grow. Like I said, the pastors would identify that leadership community and be intentional about spending extra time there. And then they really encouraged us. So in two directions. So we had apprentices, we had people that we
Right.
were building into. There were always freshmen coming in that needed that kind of time with us. So we were receiving it and then practicing it. And then just from a peer standpoint, they would tell us you need to be in, peer groups. And I think I told you the story. They literally, they walked up to me and two other guys were like, you're an accountability group now.
Yeah.
And so to this day, honestly, I'm catching up with those guys in about a month.
Yeah.
We catch up. And even in my new role, my new job, when that was a possibility, I got with them on the phone and was kind of accountable to them to explain the process, the decision making. They challenged me. Have you thought about this? You should really look into X. And so I kind of put myself kind of under their leadership a little bit. Like
Right.
the decision I was going to make, one, had to pass muster with my wife, my
Right.
ultimate partner, but then also with these guys that I put myself in accountability with. I did. I put myself under their kind of authority to say, is this a good decision?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's carried through from college.
So let me ask you, because when you talk about New Life Campus Fellowship, now New Life Christian Fellowship, the apprentices that you were serving were just a few years behind you, I think,
Oh, yeah.
and the guys that you were apprenticing under were just a few years ahead of you. So there is value in that to have someone who's, just a step or two further up the road. But we also need some guys who can look back at 20 years ago
Totally.
and say, "Man, if I could talk to myself back at 20, this is what I would have said." And so, there's value in all of these relationships. But I think you also had some seasoned men that came in that were able to give you the wisdom and the perspective of a longer time horizon. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So in addition to the pastors there, we get to Richmond a couple of years later for a church plant. And so we were part of that. And really as a process of that, there were some of the co-pastors there that were, call it 15, 20 years ahead of me.
Yeah.
And one of them literally walked up to me and said, young man, you need a mentor.
Yeah.
It was just as clear as day. And I'm in my 20s, just, graduated from tech. I'm like, okay, sure. And he was absolutely right. I mean, at the time, all I needed to do was kind of obey. And here was a guy that was older than me that wanted to build into me. I
Yeah.
was always game for that, and little did I know, I had just gotten to Richmond, a city with a lot of complex history,
Yeah.
I was cutting my teeth in ministry that wasn't my college ministry.
Right.
Lots of ways that can and does go wrong. And so I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah.
And that's lived experience that, these older guys were able to kind of guide me a little bit more. You're kind of idealistic in general, but definitely in your
Yeah.
20s, you got a lot of ideas and no experience.
Right. But
So,
let me ask you a question. You said we came to Richmond. So were you married at that time?
yeah. So in May of 2005, I graduate from tech with my wife, Katie. We get married and we moved to Richmond and
Okay.
all of that. But that was, yeah, that was to make a long story short, we were supposed to plant a church coming out of Blacksburg. And we had just planted one in LA a couple years before that. But I was pretty convinced that I heard, God say go to Richmond.
Yeah.
And so, I said, hey, raised my hand. We're coming to Richmond. We're going to do the church plant. And the pastors called me a couple weeks later, and they said, hey, Snook, the plant's off for now. We just sent 50 leaders to LA. We've got to wait. And I kind of went back to God like I was informing him of something, like, well, Lord, that
Yeah.
plant's not happening. So we're going to go back to the drawing board here. And he just said, well, I didn't misspeak when I told you to go to Richmond. Like, you're
Right.
not. And I was frustrated. I was like, I don't know
Yeah.
what the plan is, God. I don't know anybody in Richmond. I didn't have a church to plant. And it wasn't a couple weeks later, had dropped a guy a line that said, hey, friend of a friend, we should catch up when I'm in Richmond. And he said, he wrote back, he said, it's funny you just emailed me because that morning he had told his church that he was coming into the city to plant a church for the city. And so our first Sunday in Richmond was the first Sunday of this plant. So
Wow.
God's got a plan. You just got to stay in the general direction of His will, and He kind of sorts out the specifics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing that you followed through, even though what you presumed was your primary reason for coming here, just kind of the wheels came off of that wagon, but there was another purpose that you couldn't see at the time. I also have to stop because I believe that the guy who intercepted you and said, "Hey, dude, you need a mentor," is a guy that we both know and love, and that's Don Coleman, correct?
Absolutely. Don is a spiritual father of mine, and very much has been gracious with his time and guidance over the years. And so, again, when I didn't know it, and just consistently over the years, has made time. He was head of the school board, for a
Right.
stint, and he would still make time to get lunch with me,
Yeah.
and so and I don't think he can. He's in a lot of lives, but I knew that he was prioritizing me. I knew I had open
Right.
access, and I think that's key with a mentor relationship. Is like I know I could pick up the phone and call.
Yeah.
I didn't
Even now.
right now. I won't do it, but
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
so yeah, that helped me a lot, and it also taught me a lot about being a mentor. And him and others, they challenge me now. Who are you building into?
Right.
And it's a good challenge. Like, oh yeah, now I need to be intentional about this too. And I think we talked a little bit about it, but so I turned 46 this year, and I had a career coach a couple of years ago. And your 40s are kind of, we could do a whole podcast on men in their 40s,
Yeah.
but he asked me, he said, would you have any advice for your 25-year-old self?
Right.
And I just kind of, without even thinking about it, I was like, oh gosh, I could write a book about the last
Yeah.
20 years and like what I did right, what I did wrong. And he kind of challenged me. It was kind of evident on the call as soon as I said it. Like, well, don't you think there's some 25-year-olds out there that could use the advice you would give to your 25-year-old self, things you wish you knew. And so I kind of grabbed onto that in the last couple of years. I don't, we talked about old men, who I love, but even, there's something for me to give,
Right.
guys and gals in their 20s, that's just lived experience. So there's something that's very much on my heart, and I think how we got on the same call here is, putting out the call to men that, those 60, 70-year-olds should be finding the 40, 50-year-olds, should be finding the 20, 30-year-olds, and just taking that 10, 20 years of life that you have on that person, and giving them, insight. So
Yeah.
it could be what you did right. It could be what you did wrong.
Well, and the truth is, we probably learn more from what we do wrong, from our mistakes, than we do from the things that we get right. There's very little learning that takes place on something that goes well, because you don't have to stop and ask yourself, well, why'd that happen? We just keep going thinking that we're living this charmed existence, it seems. So let me ask you this. Why do you think there is this reluctance for the generations to connect? What are some of the barriers that you think exist that keep us from being able to make these connections? Just from your lived experience there, why is that hard to pull off?
I mean, two things that come to mind. I mean, and it's directional. I think for the guys that need discipleship, I think
Yeah.
it maybe, I don't know if it's uniquely a male thing, but our egos get in the way. We think of ourselves as finished products when, we really, if you're not growing, you're dying, right? And so I think that a big mistake adults make in general, and men in particular make, is this idea that, like, I'm good, like I don't have anywhere to grow. I couldn't, gain some insight from another person. And then for men that aren't building into people around them, I don't think they feel like they have anything to offer.
Right.
Like they're not some sage, super successful. Like, so we've got this kind of off-kilter vision of what a successful person looks like, and that they're the only people that know anything. But you said it earlier, like I am a product of my failures and my successes. That's the lived experience that I bring into a conversation. And so I can tell you 10 ways not to do something too.
Yeah.
And I just don't think people are owning that as something that would be valuable to other people.
Well, the fact that you have 10 ways not to do something and one way to do something, maybe you can save someone else the pain of walking through those 10 failures. That's the win. And you're a computer science guy. You're a tech guy. One of the things that I talk about with folks all the time is that most of us carry a smartphone in our pockets or somewhere on our person, and we can ask Siri or Google or Alexa or whatever she or he happens to be called in your system. We can ask them for facts and generally get a lot of good information, but there's a long distance between facts and wisdom. And so I think young people are hungry for some wisdom, but they're drowning in facts. Is that a fair statement? How would you respond to that?
I like it. It's the seasoning that happens, So, I'd say particularly your folks in their 30s, like you know a lot, but it hasn't worked itself through your life quite yet. You can't count it as a lived experience. And then I think we just have to find, I could say it about myself, like I didn't know the half of what I didn't know when I was in my 20s, right. But you walk around, and we can say this in love, because it really is out of a spirit of love, that our 20-something friends, they don't know as much as they think they do. Like, right. You're on top of the world is your oyster, but you don't know much. You haven't lived much, and so that's hard to tell somebody in love in a way that they'll receive it. Just that you got a lot you got a lot of ideas, but you haven't lived them out yet. And you really do need these older guys as sounding boards, because I've been warned away from things. I'm glad somebody was there to tell me, don't do that, or watch it here, So yeah, I think it just, I can't imagine anybody, well, I shouldn't say this, under the age of 40, there's just haven't lived enough. I mean, some people, God has some real meaty stories. There are definitely some people that have lived some life, the first 40 years, but I just think it's an element of time. Wisdom is an element of time.
Yeah. Well, and the younger we are, I think now, and this is probably chronological age, but also spiritual age. We have a tendency to believe that we can take the world on by ourselves, on our own, and we forget that if we are born again, if we are walking with Christ, then our strength is not our own. Our strength is His strength. Our wisdom comes from Him. Our sustenance comes from Him, and we begin to understand that we are relying on a supernatural source that is the Lord and Creator of the universe. But without someone to help us see that and understand it and put it into practice, get our hands wrapped around it, we believe that we're the ones that are 10 feet tall and bulletproof and that we have the answers, and we're operating in the flesh when we have to lean into what the Lord can do in us and through us and for us, lest we just keep banging our heads against the wall and driving ourselves in a ditch. Is that a statement you can agree with and kind of comment on?
Life gets big and the stakes get high. Like you think the stakes are high, like you don't know. I mean, the life and death stuff, and once you've got a I mean, if you think about your 30s as you're building your life, you get to your 40s again. Not to harp on that, but the wife, kids, house, job, it's a lot. And I consciously or subconsciously, I do think you come to a moment of realization that if you try to do all this in your strength, it's going to fail or you're going to crack. The number of guys that I've talked to, especially senior leaders, that if you ask them what their crash year is, they can tell you. Like my crash year was 2017. I was trying to do it, my own strength, and you just crack. Like it's too much. And I think that, again, even just giving that wisdom to guys as I see their lives growing and bigger than them to, I think I've headed off a couple crash years with people around me by just saying, hold on, I've seen this. Like, and I know where you're going. I know what next year is going to look like if you don't lay off a little bit, trust God, if they're a believer. So just even being able to kind of warn people away from what you're saying, like that's exactly the moment you got to lean on, God in particular and the people around you too.
Well, there's a verse, I think it's in Ephesians, that says, "Be careful then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, for the days are numbered," or something. I'll misquote that, but for the days are evil, I think. But so the idea there is we are on a pathway. There's people feel differently about Andy Stanley at different times, but he wrote this book called the Principle of the Path. And so the idea is that we walk on a path, and sometimes we're looking just a few steps in front of us to make sure that we don't trip over something that's immediate. But if we're not careful and we don't have some help, then we're not paying attention to the actual direction that we're going in. And we can find ourselves not tripping, but ending up in the wrong place because we haven't paid attention to where we're actually going. And so there are times when we need some people around us to help us with a 360-degree view of what's going on around us and where we are vulnerable, where Satan is looking to penetrate our lives and take us out, because he's working all the time at that. We know that from Peter's epistles.
Yeah. It's just the humility that's necessary to say that, you don't have all the answers. I need God every day. I need the people around me. The people around me have permission to speak into my life. And so that's a leadership can be lonely anyways.
Yeah.
I make it a point when I talk to leaders to ask them how they're doing, because I always say that nobody asks a leader how they're doing.
Right.
It's a lonely place. And so I think even more so as you get on, you have to invite people in to, like, hey, challenge me. Tell me I'm doing something wrong. Tell me I'm trying to do too much. But there's real humility there. You're not as smart or strong as you think you are.
Right. But it does take some humility to receive that and to not take it personally, but to see that someone is truly caring for me
Saying it in
and
love.
not trying to take me out. Well, listen, let me, Titus 2 is a place where we see intergenerational ministry kind of mapped out. So I'm going to read a portion of this here that I always think is fascinating. But as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine. Older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good and to train the young women to love their husbands and children and to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, submissive to their husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. So I don't want to talk about the older women and the younger women. I like focusing on the older men and the younger men because that's kind of the world that I live in. And so you've got that long list of instructions for older women to teach younger women. And then it says, likewise, urge the younger men to be self-controlled. And I just think it's so classic that there's one thing we're trying to tell younger guys, and that Paul points out to Titus here, and that is keep control of yourself. Be self-controlled because, man, young men will chase, and I still do it, we'll chase a rabbit, we'll chase a shiny object, we will go off and let our guard down, our judgment will be distracted, what have you, and we end up in these hard places. And so teach the young men to be self-controlled. So what does it look like for an older man to teach a younger man to be self-controlled? I realize I'm kind of coming out of left field with you with that, but what does it look like to encourage a young man to be self-controlled?
Gosh, yeah, that is there's a lot there. I mean, that I'd have to think through because, I mean, men in general, I think we've got to work on, being kind of sober-minded and under control. I think a lot of what you see, not to get too big on things, but like just men out of control. Like there's just, and there is that sense of like, get a hold of yourself, like, and be that humility, be that humble person, be that person that, is trying to be more like Jesus, love like he does, serve the people around you like he did. He was laying an example for us, and I just don't think there's enough introspection. Men at any age, like this, is the way you're behaving match what Jesus modeled in the Gospels. Right. A lot of guys would have to be honest that it's not. And so that's where we can kind of in love come alongside each other and say, like, I don't think that's how Jesus would go about that. But then to your point, Mike, if you flip about 2 pages to the left there, 2 Timothy 2:2, and Paul lays out 4 generations of disciples.
That's
so
right.
The things you've heard from me, entrust to
That's
reliable
right.
men that will pass it on to others. And so there is that intentionality, like, and he says it all the time, especially in Timothy and Titus, the things that I did, I want you to emulate. I want you to follow that. And then once you've done that, go pass it along.
Yeah.
So Paul was conscious about the example he was making to Timothy and Titus and Luke and the guys that he had around him that he was discipling.
Yeah, so much so that many places he said, follow my example. The 1 Corinthians 11:1, I love that one. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ.
As I follow.
And so, but what he's inviting folks there is he doesn't just say, follow my example. He says, as I follow the example of Christ, and so, or as I follow Christ. And so he's really pointing them to Jesus, which is what we have to do. I mean, he's the perfect one, and we are just striving for some sort of asymptotic relationship to that perfection, and it never is going to be achieved, but not this side of glory anyway.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. I know that you have you've left the corporate world or the business world in computer science, and you've recently taken a new career turn with an organization called SupportWorks Housing in Richmond. So tell me what you're doing, what SupportWorks does, and what you're doing there, because I think there's some crossovers here, because there are guys who make bad decisions, and it's one after another, and they end up in a place where they never expected to be. Is that yeah, so tell me that.
Yeah, life happens. But yeah, I mean, my story, again, very focused on local missions. Actually started volunteering for what was called at the time Virginia Supportive Housing. So we've just rebranded to SupportWorks to highlight the importance of support services that we provide. So 14 years volunteer, 7 years on the board, three as
Yeah.
the chair, and I'm going into my fourth month on staff. But just to really, again, I think your 40s are kind of a liminal space, and I had the opportunity to take something that I very much, was passionate about, and make a second career out of it. But I mean, I think the way I say it is that there's no homeless people in heaven. I think why should Christians care about this? Because if we are practicing heaven, which is what God asks us to do, we should be bothered by the fact that somebody's going to sleep under a bridge today. That is not okay. And just especially as Christian men should be able to say like I'm not okay with that, especially when the resources are there. But I think that I think a lot of it is understanding. Advocating, and I'd say that for anybody that's listening to this, advocating for, folks that, life just happened, and it's hard. Life is hard. Really any American, I'm going to botch the statistic, doesn't have the liquid assets to cover a $600 emergency bill. You're one lost job, one medical emergency, one broke down car from not being able to make your rent or home, and with housing prices doing what they're doing, it's really raised the national kind of attention of this issue.
Right.
So, who can afford a $550,000 house? And what does that do to rent down the street? And so it really is something that I think, we all need to kind of grapple with. And what's important there is that I think when we see somebody down on their luck, we should not assume a series of bad decisions necessarily happened. It's what the science tells us is that actually when people were shown images of people experiencing homelessness, you almost untrained will see that person as less than a human being. And I think it's incredibly important for us, especially with our faith, to be able to kind of look with Jesus's eyes. So there's a story in Acts where I believe Peter and James or Peter and John were walking, and there was a man sitting on the street. And I think the piece that we miss in that story is Peter went over, turned to him and looked at him. Like, look at him. Don't pass by. Don't look over him or past them or ignore them. Like, look at him. That's another human being made in the image of God. And I think that kind of compassion. So, I would just encourage people. There's a lot of worthy causes out there. There's a lot of things that people need. If I have the floor for a second, I'll just say, like, before you get a lot of those things to stick, you got to get a roof over people's heads. And that's why I think out of a myriad of very worthy causes to me, I knew that housing was a place where we had to start. And that's really where SupportWorks really excels, is that we then take them, permanently house them, and then we wrap services around them, whatever they need. They don't have to go somewhere else. Because often as anything, a lot of the things that they're struggling with, they came into that state while they were homeless. Once they became homeless, like, people don't realize that being homeless is a really traumatic thing, and so
Right.
so for any number of reasons, physically, mentally, any period of homelessness can take its toll. So when you're seeing somebody that looks like they're in pretty rough shape, we didn't know him before he was homeless. And he probably looked a lot more like us than we want to admit. So, yeah, I mean, I think so. The biggest thing I think is seeing the humanity in people that are experiencing homelessness, and then being an advocate. If somebody wants to build 10 affordable homes in your neighborhood, be the person that says, that's pretty great. I think that's going to help the problem here. Be one of those people that advocates for it and doesn't just say, it's going to do this or that to my neighborhood. Like, no, it's not. No, it's not.
Yeah.
So, I really would encourage people to inform themselves and really have compassion. We're Christians, right?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I have started, one of the things as I read my Bible, I'm looking for God speaking about His love for the orphans, the widows, prisoners, and sojourners, and I think the homeless would be primarily in the category of sojourners. Although there are some other of these categories, orphans and widows, that they could fall under as well. But the sojourner is on a journey and doesn't have a place to go or permanent fixture. And but over and over and over again, God speaks in His Word of His love for these four categories of people very consistently. And we do better with some than with others, but there is a need for us to live and act with compassion. And so, just very briefly, because I want to be guarded with our time, but so you try to give them permanent housing. So you encounter someone who is homeless or is struggling in that way, and you help them with housing, and then begin a process of trying to bring support systems around them. So give me a little bit more information about what that looks like and how maybe a church could be involved in that, or some men who have a similar passion could get involved in something like that.
Absolutely. And, one of the big things to realize, people are like, oh, should we be focused on temporary shelters, permanent supportive housing, affordable housing? And the answer is yes, all of it. Like, it's called a continuum of care. And it really depends on where people are at any given time. For us, permanent supportive housing is important because we really are housing some of the hardest to house. So what's called the chronic homeless. They can be there as long as they need to. Average stay is about 6 to 7 years. And like I said, and then services staff are available in the building, really for anything that they need, from a lost ID. If I lost my ID, I don't know what I'd do. And so from that to, mental health assistance, other kind of, physical, needs that they have, the staff is really there to help them. And what's amazing about our solution is that 96% of our residents stay housed. So we can truly say that when the way the model works, and that's why we say SupportWorks, when people come in and they're housed in this environment, that they stay housed and they flourish. So then it really just becomes a capacity play. So we know every year how many people are experiencing homelessness in our locality, because HUD requires, without getting too much into the weeds, that we do what's called a point in time count. So really what we're saying is that if we knew it's not going to be the same 300 people year over year, but we're going to say that our homeless population is X. If you had the number of units necessary to meet that need, you reach what's called effective zero. You can actually end homelessness in a locality. And that's usually when people kind of lean forward in their chair, because they think about homelessness like world peace, like, oh, that's a great idea. But no, we have a plan to end homelessness in Virginia. It's going to take all the partners and all the solutions. But so I would say for churches, there's a couple things. I mean, one is, I think that this is a justice issue that's worth people learning more. And so I'll go to any room, any church that'll give me 15 minutes, just to get more informed on that. I know for our area, we have unit or facilities that are about 80 or so units apiece. My church is going to go there and do a game and dinner night. There's different ways to even just kind of sit with the residents and support them. And then, like I said, the biggest thing is that, like, we try to build housing and the neighbors come out and just shout it down. Knock down my property value. There's certain kind of codes we use for people we do and don't want in our neighborhoods. And so I think if for Christians, if we can say, like, that's a nice housing complex, we would welcome that in our neighborhood, that we want to be those kinds of people. And then there is some legislation going through the state right now that would give churches who own a ton of real estate, if we're honest, more freedom to be able to build, affordable housing or, whatever they kind of deem. So there's an opportunity in the next couple of years, I think, for the church to really be at the forefront of advocating for people that are in need. And then also probably, it might be weird for a church to think about building affordable housing, But if you have land, and you find a partner, it's not out of the realm of possibility, and a lot of churches are thinking about it.
Well, that's fascinating. And I know there are people in churches that have the skill sets and the wherewithal to be able to do some things like that. So, wow. Well, this has been a helpful conversation talking about the whole intergenerational piece and how folks have invested in you and how you can invest in others. I mentioned that Don Coleman is a mutual friend. We've had Don Coleman on as a podcast guest, so folks will make sure we link to that podcast so that you can listen to that as well. Because he's just been a friend and just a fantastic champion for Noble Warriors and has been an encourager to me personally. So I'm thankful. I've spent some time on Don's porch as well, as I know you have. So it's great stuff. And thanks for the information about the homeless needs, because that is a blessing as well that we can, I hope some men will see, okay, this is a calling that I could get into. This is a way I could be the body, the hands and the feet of Christ and serve the community. So we'll make sure we give a link to SupportWorks and your information there so they could reach out if they would so desire. So
please do.
Hope that'll be okay. Yeah.
I'm on LinkedIn. It's supportworkshousing.org. And I'd love to talk more about it.
Awesome. Well, Jason, thanks so much. Any final comments for our listeners today?
I think that you are a combination of somebody that has a wealth of life experiences that you could offer somebody else, and you should. And you should also be open to men that are older than you, and you should be seeking them out. And I think if we're seeking each other out in both directions, I think God can use that to grow us. So,
Amen. Good stuff. All right. Well, Jason, thanks so much for your time, folks. We're going to sign off for this episode of the Noble Man Podcast, and we'll be back next week with another guest and another episode of the Noble Man Podcast. God bless you, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.